Vladimir Kramnik's victory against Garry Kasparov in their World Championship match in 2000 was in no small part due to his adoption of the Berlin defence against the Spanish. He basically managed to shut out Kasparov, who was unable to score with the white pieces. Well, 6 months later, Kasparov managed to gain a little bit of consolation for that defeat with a victory against Kramnik's Berlin defence in a tournament in Astana in Kazakhstan. Let's take a look at that game. It's very interesting to see how Kasparov finally managed to breach Kramnik's defences against the Berlin, and somehow it's a very instructive game. So, the Berlin defence from Kramnik. By the way, I hope I'm not giving the game away when I'm already telling you the results, but okay, this is history. So, if White wants to keep a bit of tension in the position, then the way that many players are doing it these days is just by playing d3, protecting the pawn on e4. For example, Carlsen and Anand play in this way and don't do badly playing like this, but of course it's a more modest system. But the principal move is just to castle here. But this, almost by force, allows this Berlin endgame, and this is the endgame that Kasparov struggled with in the World Championship match and just couldn't break down. So let me just go through these first few moves fairly quickly. I mean, there are many ways that White can set up his stall here, but what Kasparov is doing in this game is pretty standard so far. Now you can choose where you want to place this bishop, whether you put it on f4, sometimes it goes this way. In this game, Kasparov chose to put the bishop on b2, and this has a profound effect on the game. This moment is a massive decision for Black. He has to choose on which side to put his king. And you'll recall that in many of the games in their World Championship match, Kramnik played the king to c8, and then after b6, king b7, it hid on the queen side, and in that way connected the rooks. In this game, and that's possible here, and Kramnik played that later on. In this game, Kramnik chooses to put the king to e8. I mean, obviously there are pros and cons to both moves. This way, you can bring this rook to the centre very quickly, and if you can trade off one pair of rooks, that means the king's a bit safer. But it might take longer to connect the rooks by keeping the king in the middle of the board like this. So Kasparov keeps developing, and the rook comes over. And now this next move from Black, knight e7, has become very popular. Basically what Black is doing is preempting the advance of the g-pawn, because this is clearly White's plus in this position, this kingside pawn majority. And if he can get this rolling with g4 and knight moves f4, then he's getting somewhere. So what Black does is preempt this and put the knight on a square here, where somehow it gets out of the way. But also, sometimes you can bring the bishop to f5 too to hit this pawn on c2. Rook f e1 from Kasparov. I mean, this all looks very regular, very nice development from White. But we've seen this so often in the Berlin. White gets so far and looks very good, but then can't come any further. Let's see, knight g6, knight e4. You can see things are coming to a head. White's pieces are beautifully placed, but he has yet to break through. Now, you could say a very standard way of playing this position here is something like bishop e6, just to block out White's pieces and to try to trade on the d file. But here, I think this is a relatively easy position for White to play. Although a pair of rooks are traded, you can see that getting rid of one of the bishops robs Black's position of its dynamism, and it's much easier for white to try and push forward on the king side now. In a later game between, well, two decent players, Almashi played here c5, which I quite like actually, to put the bishop here. You know, that's certainly not a bad move, but you know, it takes a lot of courage. Already you have to watch out for things on the e-file, for tactics on the e-file. So for example, bishop e7, not a good move, because then the knight throws itself in. White gets back the piece, and you can see that all white's pieces are working beautifully there. Kramnik tried knight f4, and this looks too cavalier. Well, that's said with hindsight. Kasparov's next move is beautiful and really thematic. He played e6. So basically, before this knight blockades on the e6 square, which would certainly solidify black, Kasparov makes sure that this diagonal remains open, and also the e-file. Now let's have a look at some tactics. Well, first of all, what happens if pawn takes? Then the bishop comes in and recovers the pawn here. Black's position is dreadful. You know, white is going to be able to use the d6 square and position an appalling situation for black. What about bishop takes? Looks solid, but there's a tactic. Great move, knight f6. If the king comes up, then we win material. The king has to keep guard of the rook. And if pawn takes, then white wins material like this, and the rook drops in the corner. So knight takes is just about forced here. Now, what's beautiful about this is that white doesn't get back the pawn straight away, but just has pressure. It's just giving up this pawn just opens up the lines. And remember, it looks as though black's king could castle here. It can't castle, it's already moved. Very difficult for black to bring his king to safety. After the game, Kasparov thought that bishop e5 was actually the best move. So that threatens to take a pawn here, and after the rook comes across, then simply knight h4 with the idea of advancing the f-pawn is terribly dangerous, and it's really difficult for black to free himself here. But he played knight d4, which also looks terrifying. Again, an idea might be to advance the f-pawn, but also the idea is to bring the knight to f5. I mean, there's not a lot that black can do to prevent that. This is what happened in the game, so there's clearly going to be threats here. If the bishop comes back, then knight f6 again wins material in the same way as we saw before. So Kramnik played this really ugly move to protect the g7 pawn. And now the pieces fly in. It's incredible how white can get so close but can't completely crack black's position. Well, first of all, if that's taken, then that is checkmate, but Kramnik just remains solid here. Now, here Kasparov chose to take back his pawn, but it might have been even better if he'd maintained the pressure, advance this pawn, and then simply threatens to move the knight out of the way, advance this pawn again, and it's very hard to see how black's king is going to free itself. Okay, instead he grabbed the material back. Well, if this is taken with the rook, then this is a very attractive checkmate. And, well, knight takes, it doesn't look good, does it? Yeah, and mate next move. So bishop takes is just about forced, and now white wins the material back and takes the bishop here. Now I would count this as a bit of a success for black after, 5 moves ago, after this pawn sack e6. This means that black has survived and somehow freed his position. It's not so bad. Now obviously, if you look at the pawn structures, then white is better here. This regular pawns here, and black's pawns are split on the king side. So white is definitely better, but not easy to convert this. Kramnik's problem was that he was running very short of time. Just to survive that very difficult position, he had to invest a lot of time to work out the tactics. I think with best play, black should probably hold this position, but it's tricky. He probably thought that after this move he was going to win a pawn back, but Kasparov found this excellent move, preventing knight takes pawn check. If knight takes, then rook g1 wins material because of the pin, and if rook takes, then knight here undermines the support for the rook. The knight will drop, or the rook drops. So after king h1, Kramnik tried this and activated the rook in this way. Well, if the rooks are traded well, then this knight will hop in and gain counterplay on the queen side. But Kasparov maintained control here and now took the pawn. Well, it's a double-edged position. Black has a pawn down, but at least he's managed to activate his rook. So this is still very tricky, and you could say this knight is well, a long way from anywhere sensible. But fantastic the way Kasparov manages to somehow coordinate his position. So bringing the rook up here is a great move. It achieves so much. First of all, he's threatening to take the c-pawn, but he also wants to come to the f5 square, and that will hit this, and also helps to support the knight. And here probably, again, this is said with hindsight, Kramnik's best would be to take this pawn and simply give up material here and just take as many pawns as possible. And white has winning chances, but it's hard to say whether it's, he can actually force a win. If you compare this with the game situation where he took on f2 first, remember he was short of time, and again this beautiful move, rook f5, hitting here, this pin is very nasty indeed. Now Kramnik tried to defend as best he could. Now Kasparov didn't take here because I think king g6 would be pretty annoying, but instead he played knight g4, excellent move. So hitting the rook has to maintain, or would like to maintain, protection of the knight. If the rook checks, then the king comes up, and basically, well, on the next turn we're going to play g3, and because of the pin, black is going to lose material. So Kramnik just tried to grab pawns here. But you remember in the other position, he could have had this pawn as well, and that, I think that would have made a big difference. But here Kasparov could just play the rook back, holding the pawn on the queen side. And now, well, Kramnik still has two pawns for the piece, but I think crucially Kasparov's position is very solid here. He's able to maintain protection of his pawns and his pieces. You can see that he's regained coordination. His knight is back in a sensible position. And here, the advance of the h-pawn is actually decisive. Let's just see the finish of the game. And knight here. Again, you can see white's coordination is superb here. The knight is protected by the rook, and the knight will support the advance of the pawn. And here, Kramnik actually resigned. Excuse me. There's no defence to the advance of the pawn. If the rook comes back, then rook h2, followed by h7, and that's that. So, a little bit of consolation for Kasparov in finally defeating Kramnik's Berlin defence, but well, even today you can see the popularity of this opening for black, and actually, of course, improvements were found on this game, and it is very, very hard to defeat this robust opening.